Well, this is the first lesson of maybe the most interesting book in the Old Testament because it's very unique. It may be the oldest book. We know that the book of Job is about a man named Job, and we know where he was from, but we don't know where that place represents today. Many Bible scholars think this is the oldest book in the Bible, that it even predates the first 5, which Moses wrote. There's some clues that make me kind of lean in that direction as well. It has the most ancient form of Hebrew that's in the Old Testament, equivalent to some that Moses used. It's unusual in this respect. There is no mention of God's covenant with Abraham or his promises to his descendants. No mention of Moses and the law of God and the covenant with that group of people. Nothing about worship in the tabernacle, priest, sacrifices, offerings, feast days. None of the history of Israel is in this book, and that makes it unique because every other Old Testament book, and as I run through New Testament books in my mind, they all refer to something in the history of Israel, but this book does not. In fact, Jews today include it in their Old Testament, but they do not read it in the synagogue because they don't think it's especially for them. Another thing that makes this book seem very old has to do with the lifespans of the people in it. Noah and Adam and Methuselah all lived to be older than 900 years. And Noah's son, Shem, lived 600 years. And Shem's son, Shelah, lived 435 years. Do you notice this is going downhill as we go? Abraham lived less than 200 years, about 175. Years later, Moses and his brother and sister Miriam and Aaron lived around 120 years. But by the time we get to King David, he only lived 70 years. And I guess he wrote that psalm in Psalm 90:10, where it says 70 is the length of man's life, or maybe by reason of strength 80 or 80. So the lifespan back in that day is equivalent to the lifespan today. Now, we don't know how old Job was when this story was told, but we do know from the last chapter and one of the last verses that he lived 140 years after the events described. And we know that at the time the events occurred, he had 10 adult children that had all established their own homes. And so most Bible scholars think he had to be at least 50 to have had that many grown and gone and established, or maybe even up to 70 years old when this happened. Job has more references to the creation of the heavens and the earth than the book of Genesis does, and it gives us more details. And that kind of makes me think, well, maybe Job lived when word of mouth was still going down generations about what God did. There are some who say Job was not a real person, that the book is fiction, and he did not really exist. But that's people who don't want to believe the Bible anyway. So I do not join that school of thought. I believe he was a real person because he is mentioned as a real person in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. In Ezekiel 14, in a passage where God is speaking, he says to Ezekiel, though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the city that I've ordained for destruction, they would only deliver their own souls by their righteousness. They could not save the city. In fact, in that passage, Ezekiel 14:12 through 20, 4 times he references them. The first time and the last time he calls them Noah, Daniel, and Job. And the middle 2, he says if those 3 men were there, they still could not stop the judgment from coming. And in the New Testament, James 5:11, we read, "Ye have heard of the patience of Job. He was considered a real person." Now, because he is mentioned 4 times by God himself in the Old Testament in the company of Noah and Daniel, if you say that Job did not exist, you might have to say Noah and Daniel don't exist or did not exist. But the Lord Jesus in Matthew 24, in his preaching, he mentioned both of those men. And Jesus believed that they were alive. And I know that Jesus would know. The book of Job is kind of different from the settings of other books, which have brief vignettes about individuals, and they are followed by theological truth or preaching interspersed in there. But this book is written exactly like a drama from beginning to end. We are watching something unfold in Job's life. And so much more than we know about any event in any Bible character's life, because we also know what Job was thinking, and we know the words of conversations that he had with other people and other people had with him. Well, like any good story or book or movie, there is a prologue in the beginning of Job. I think if you had English in high school, you remember Dickens and the Tale of Two Cities, and you probably remember how it begins. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Or in the movie Gone with the Wind, which I expect that many of you have seen in your life. The first scenes for 15 seconds show old-timey farm scenes in the South, and words scroll across the screen. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton in the Old South. And then for 15 seconds, they set the scene. And it ends by saying, it was a civilization that's gone with the wind. And so that is your introduction, not only to the setting, but to the title of the book. Well, look at the prologue. What is written in Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Probably the location of Job City was at the very northern side of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula today, and that is based on the enemies that Job had, the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans, because that was an area in which they were active. But these wonderful descriptions of his character. Job was outwardly perfect. Now, that does not mean without sin. That means consistently doing right with integrity. His reputation was impeccable. And we are told not only was he outwardly perfect, toward God he had an attitude. It says he fears God. And probably that's what kept him on the straight and narrow path. And then his inward mindset, what he thought himself, he eschewed or avoided evil. Maybe it was because he feared God, and maybe it was because he wanted to do right. So what a guy. I'm impressed before we go any farther. And then in the remaining verses, we have some other descriptors. Verse 2, there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And in verse 4, we have his family described again. As adults, his son went and feasted in their houses, every one his day. Probably that means his birthday. And sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. This was a family that enjoyed each other. They liked to be together. They had something like our Christmas dinner, well, at least for the son's birthday, 7 months out of the year. Very rarely in social events in this time and even to this day in this part of the world are women and men included. So it was very precious of them to include their sisters in this. That's his family, and then we are told about his wealth. And this is the way wealth is also described in the book of Genesis, not in coinage or bank account, but in livestock. And we are told he had 7,000 sheep. That was a very large cash group of animals to have because you needed them for their wool and you needed them for their meat. And that was the common animal of sacrifice in worship, whether you worshiped the true God or idols. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. Makes me think he was involved in international commerce because that was like the 18-wheelers of today, carrying things through the desert. Camels were also kept for their milk. 500 yoke of oxen, that meant they were plowing something. Now, although that land is pretty arid and desert today, maybe he irrigated it, or maybe it's changed since he lived there. Sounds like they had crops. And 500 female donkeys, which they were used to bear burdens and also for plowing sometimes. In fact, this conglomerate of animals and the huge amount of servants it would have taken to take care of them made Job, at the end of verse 3, it says he was the greatest of all the men of the land east of the Jordan River. As I was studying, I thought, what did Job do with his wealth? We know one thing his children did. They had a big feast on their birthday for all their siblings. What about Job? Much later in the book, we're going to catch a glimpse of what he did. I will tell you it's in chapters 29 and 31, and that reference is on the class sheet. But we are told, what did he do with his resources? He rescued needy people. He personally cared for handicapped people and people that were dying, that were hospice patients. He brought orphans into his own home. And he would take the power barons of his day to court to argue when they had ruled against poor people and stolen from them. So he was a very wonderful man. I don't see that he spent anything on himself. It was for others. Well, look at verse 5 of chapter 1. He was also devoted to God. And this is in the context of the sons having the feast. And it was so when the days of their feasting were over that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all, burnt offerings for each. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. I see that praying for his children was a priority. He got up early to do it. He used the method of Genesis to worship God. There was no priest, there was no tabernacle, but the head of the family, the male of the family, built an altar for his family. And that's what he did here. And it's interesting to me what he said about doing this, because maybe my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. All my life, I've thought that was a very strange thing to say about this happy family. And I was appalled when I realized in study that the word which is translated cursed in the King James in that verse is used 8 times in the book of Job, and 4 times it's translated cursed, and 4 times it's translated blessed. How can one word have opposite meanings? Well, this comes from the context of the word. And in further study, I learned that it's a word for saying goodbye to someone. And you can either say, "Oh, goodbye, be careful, I love you." That's one kind of goodbye. Or there's another kind of goodbye that says, "Good riddance, I'm glad you're going." And Job may have thought in their party time, one or more of his children might have pushed God out of their minds and even said goodbye to God or good riddance to God. Not that his actions could make them be holy, but one old writer said he cast over them the shield of prayer over his children and prayed for the dispersion of evil that might have been suggested to their hearts. Now, I'm pretty sure if Job had 10 kids, he had some, they were not equal in their devotion to God. Some were more devoted, some might have been less devoted. So he prayed for the kids that were doing well and the kids that were not doing so well in the same way. What a guy. Well, in the next verses 6 to 12, we have a very surprising conversation that does not take place on earth, but takes place in heaven. And this is how I know the book of Job must be inspired, because who would ever have known about this conversation between God and Satan if God had not told someone? We're told in verse 6, "There came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them." That phrase, the sons of God, is used in the Old Testament to refer to angels. There is an Old Testament passage, in fact it's in Job chapter 38, that says the sons of God shouted for joy at the creation of the earth. Now, they were shouting before there were any people on the earth to enjoy the earth. In the New Testament, sons of God often refers to believers. But in the Old Testament, it was angels. And I believe these must have been angels because Satan used to be an angel, and apparently he still has access to heaven, which is something that was a new thought for me. We know that this was the evil being that tempted Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapter 2, he is called Satan. He is called that old serpent. In Revelation, I put it on your sheet, Revelation 12:9 and 22 have a verse that both verses say, "That old serpent called the devil and Satan," or "that old serpent which is the devil and Satan." And in Genesis, if you read the temptation chapter 3, it always says the serpent, the devil, the Satan, this one entity that leads the evil beings. And in the book of Job, in the Hebrew, there is that same definite article, the Satan, although it does not appear in the King James, in the English. This makes me think it's another indicator of an early book written about the time when the serpent was tempting people. And then Satan not only comes, God initiates a conversation with him. The Lord said to Satan, "Where'd you come from?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it." Yeah, sure, Satan. You just were out for a nice walk and you thought you'd drop by heaven. If you had a jewelry store with many expensive jewels and somebody that looked like this came in your front door, what would you think? If you said, "What are you doing?" He might say, "Oh, I just came in to walk around and look at your jewels." Would you take that? That's kind of what Satan tried to do. We're told in 1 Peter 5 that Satan walks about seeking whom he may devour, destroy, and we're to resist him. And we're told in James 4:7 that if we resist him, he will have to flee. Verse 8, God continues the conversation with Satan. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that fears God and avoids evil?" That's exactly what the first verse said. So we know the first verse is true because God said the exact same things about Job. Now, I've always kind of been worried when I read God saying this to Satan, because did God know what was about to happen? Has anything ever happened, or will anything ever happen to you and I without God's knowledge and sovereign plan in charge? And that includes some things that are hard that we will address in the study of this book. Verse 9, Satan answered the Lord and said, "Oh, Job just fears you because there's something in it for him. His wealth, his power, his riches." He doesn't deny anything about Job. He doesn't say he's not upright, or he was thinking about evil the other day. Verse 10, "Haven't you made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he has on every side? God, you have blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Satan even now hates God. Maybe Satan would like to curse God, but he dares not. So he wanted to get Job to do it. Touch all that he has. That Hebrew word translated touch means a violent touch, like a fist or a beating. Touch all that he has. And what Bible did Job have? I expect he had none. Now, we all have the Old and New Testament. We know that Romans 8:18 says the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us as time goes by in the end times. But Job had nothing. I wonder how a man like Job and a man like Enoch and a man like Noah existed in the midst of generations that were thoroughly evil. But God had somehow given revelation of himself that men could worship God. Well, It's interesting to me that Satan did not ask permission for him to touch Job. He said, you do it. I want you to do it. Now, I will just tell you from the onset, I'm reluctant to say that God allowed Satan to do this, because it's not what the Bible says. God did what happened to Job. Why would God do that? Well, our little pea brains have a hard time with this because we struggle with why God lets bad things happen to us. Hard things, painful things. What is God thinking? My husband has a book in his library, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? The answer to that question is the scriptures say there is none good, no, not one. Has to do with our inflated view of ourselves, I guess. But the Lord says to Satan, behold, all that Job has is in your power, only upon himself his body put not forth thy hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And God is here trusting Job to love him more than he loves anything he owns or even his own family. Do we love God that much? Now, this is not Satan making a challenge to God. It is God challenging Satan about his work of grace in Job's heart. And in the New Testament, there's a passage that maybe is a little bit obscure, but I believe it applies to this. Ephesians 3, in the passage of verses 8 through 11, talking about the mystery of God's grace that was hidden from creation, but is now seen by principalities and powers in heavenly places. God wanted to show the sons of God, the angels, and Satan, the former son of God, that he was in charge, that his grace could overrule even evil in a human heart. And the Bible speaks of the gospel as being something that came from heaven, and angels desire to look into that. The heavenly angels have difficulty understanding how wicked man could experience the grace of God. They desire to figure that out. Angels did not have grace. When those angels rebelled with Satan, they were immediately cast into prison. And the book of Jude tells us about this. I think it's interesting that Jesus' brother was probably the Jude that wrote that book. I wonder if they ever had a conversation about that. Well, this test also is going to show that to Job, God is what he desires the most. And Satan immediately hits him with losses. In verses 13 through 20, the news comes by a runner, the only survivor from these events, and all of his livestock is either dead or stolen. And lightning hit some, probably. We think that's what the fire of God means. And the wind, a great wind from the wilderness, it may have been a tornado. It hit the house and tore all four corners down. And it fell upon his children, and they were all killed at once. If Job had the thought, what in the world is going on? He would have had to look outside the world, wouldn't he? To see what was going on. And he had no time to say, Lord, I'm trusting you. I don't understand this, but I'm trusting you even between these trials. And in verse 20, what does Job do when he loses all of his wealth and all of his children in a moment of time? I don't think it would have taken more than a minute for those messengers to come one after another and deliver those messages. In 1 minute, everything he had is gone. Look at verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, tore his robe, and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. He doesn't say, God, what are you doing to me? He doesn't say, God, I'm your friend. You might want to do this to your enemies. He's not angry. He's not saying, why me, Lord? He fell down on the ground and worshipped. He rent his clothes and shaved his head. Those were two ancient signs of grief. And he worshipped. In the middle of this tremendous, painful loss, he worshipped. I've seen people who've grieved deeply, and I've seen people who came out of grief to worship. But I don't know that I've ever heard a testimony from one who just learned that their loved ones had died that bowed their head and worshiped. That's an unusual combination. But look at what he said in verse 21. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job had good theology. He knew that both the good things he had enjoyed in his life came from God, and the bad things were what God, for his own reasons, planned for him. And overall, he was no weaker or poorer than when he was born. And he was returning not to his mother's womb, but sometimes the earth is spoken of as mother's womb at his burial. I thought about this. I wish Job could have known about that conversation. I think it would have maybe mitigated his grief at least a tiny bit. When Judas betrayed Christ with a kiss, did our Lord rant against Judas? Or did he even stop at the great enemy behind Judas, who was Satan, and had filled Judas's heart with this desire to do this? Instead, Jesus said, the cup which my Father has given me, I will drink it. He saw his Father behind all this mistreatment of Satan. And ladies, resentment is removed when we take anything that offends us as from the hand of a loving Father. And it's so easy to get caught with the agent that does the bad thing, and to be angry and to hate them and to want to get even with them. One preacher said it doesn't really matter who is the postman. It's the writer of the letter that we are concerned with. And Job was concerned with the writer of that letter. Matthew Henry, an old expositor that I love to read, he said the God of Israel, speaking of this passage, although I want to read that, the God of Job, because I don't know if Job knew about Israel, is sometimes a God who hides himself, but he's never a God who absents himself. He never leaves us. And Job, in his grief, has the presence of God to comfort him. And the only person who ever lived on earth that God did truly forsake was his own Son on the cross. We're treading on holy ground. And then the last verse, in all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God foolishly. Spurgeon has several sermons on this text. In one of them, he says it's the business of our life, the main business of our life, one thing should be not to sin, that we keep from sin. But he said in every trial and testing, we should be especially afraid of sinning in our response to that situation. And I will confess, I have responded by being impatient, by rebellion, and even by despair, because I thought I needed to understand everything that happened to me. And I couldn't figure out why, when I was on God's team, I had all these hard things. But Job never said, Lord, what are you doing to me? He's saying, Lord, if you led me by this rough road, just keep me from falling down. I'm sometimes angered by foolish charges that sinful people and God-haters bring against God. How can he be a God of love if he permits suffering? Well, they're starting from a wrong premise. But God uses suffering, the suffering of chastisement, the suffering of a spanking, to do something to change our hearts. Revelation 3:19 says, as many as I tenderly love, that's the Greek word, as many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. That word for love is not the agape word for God's overpowering love, but the friendship word for love. God has chosen us for his friends. He has affection for us as a friend. As many as I tenderly love, I rebuke and chasten. May God grant us the ability to move beyond the person that's hurting us, to understand that God has a purpose in allowing the hurt to come to us. Stonewall Jackson was one of my favorite Confederate generals because he was a strong Christian man, and I can't imagine anything harder than being a general in the Confederacy and being a Christian. It would be hard to be at war. Even before the Civil War, just a few years before, he was a young married man, and his wife died in childbirth, and the infant was stillborn, so he lost them both in a moment. And speaking of that, his heart was broken. He loved that woman. Writing to his sister, who was not a believer, Stonewall Jackson said, my wife has now gone on a glorious visit through a gloomy portal or doorway, death. I look forward to the day when I will join her. I am reconciled to my loss and have joy in the hope of a future reunion when the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. I can willingly submit to anything as God strengthens me. Oh, my sister, I wish you knew him as your God. Well, next time we'll continue in the book of Job, at least in Job chapter 2.